The desert stretched endless and merciless beneath a sky, the color of steel, the heat shimmering like ghosts dancing on the horizon as a lone cowboy rode alongside the thunder of a passing train, his hat brim shadowing a pair of eyes that had seen too much and trusted too little, the kind of eyes that measured every sound, every flicker of movement, every whisper of trouble before it fully arrived. And trouble came suddenly that day in the form of a scream that cut through the roar of iron wheels. A woman's cry tearing the air as the train clattered forward, and he saw her body hurled from one of the rear cars, a blur of skirts and hair thrown violently into the dust, and without a second's hesitation, he dug his spurs into his horse's flanks, galloping hard until he reined up beside her crumpled form, leaping down with the quickness of a man used to making life and death choices before another breath could be taken, and when he bent to lift her, she stirred, coughing, her face streaked with blood and grit, her eyes wide with the wild terror of prey who has just escaped the jaws of the wolf but knows the wolf is still near, and he said in that steady drawl of his, low but firm, like the sound of distant thunder, "You are safe now, miss. I'll take you the rest of the way." Words simple yet heavy with a promise she could not yet believe, but in that moment they were all she had to cling to. She tried to speak, but the sound was broken, choked by dust, and when he pulled a canteen from his saddle, he tipped it gently to her lips, watching her drink as though each swallow brought her back a little more from the brink. And when she finally found her voice, it was tight, urgent, afraid, whispering of men in black dusters who had cornered her on the train, who had whispered threats in her ear, who had taken something from her before throwing her out like yesterday's trash. And though she spoke in fragments, the cowboy pieced together enough to know she wasn't some random passenger caught in misfortune. She was someone they wanted gone, someone carrying a secret heavy enough that lives had been wagered upon it. And though he had lived long enough to avoid other people's wars, there was something in her shaking hands, in the way she clutched a small satchel half hidden in the folds of her dress, that told him her fight had already become his. He hoisted her up onto his horse with care, swinging into the saddle behind her. The two of them pressed close as he turned the animal away from the tracks and toward the jagged rise of hills in the distance, knowing the train's speed would carry those men far ahead, but not for long. Because men who pushed women from trains did not give up easily, they hunted, they tracked, and sooner or later the dust behind them would bring riders in pursuit. So he pressed the horse harder, guiding it up a rocky trail where the land grew crueler and less forgiving. The kind of terrain he knew could hide two desperate souls from those who came sniffing after them. As the sun dipped lower, felt bleeding red across the land, she told him more haltingly, her voice raw from fear and dust. Her name was Clara. She had been entrusted with something she hadn't asked for, a ledger bound in cracked leather, filled with names and numbers, secrets that could topple powerful men in the territory if it ever reached the right hands. And though she hadn't understood at first, when the men boarded the train and demanded she hand it over, when they ripped at her bag and found only decoys, she knew then she was carrying dynamite more dangerous than any stick of powder. And those who wanted it back would burn the world down to get it. The cowboy listened in silence, eyes narrowing as shadows grew long around them, for he had lived enough years in the saddle to know that men would kill without hesitation for less than what she described, and though he had sworn once to keep clear of other people's wars, his code, unwritten, unshaken, never let him turn away from those thrown to the wolves, especially not when their only crime was being in the wrong place at the wrong time. So he said nothing of refusal, nothing of abandoning her to fate, only pressed the horse onward until they found the broken ruins of an old way station long abandoned, its timbers leaning, its roof half collapsed, but its shadow deep enough to give them shelter for the night. And there he built a fire, small enough not to draw attention, giving her warmth and silence in which to gather her breath while his eyes stayed ever on the horizon, scanning for the telltale plume of dust that meant riders were closing in. Night came heavy and black, stars scattered bright above, and though Clara drifted into uneasy sleep, clutching that satchel as though her life depended on it, the cowboy sat awake, rifle across his knees, every creak of timber and rustle of brush setting his nerves on edge. And sure enough, long past midnight, he saw it, the faint flicker of lantern light in the distance, bobbing like will-o'-the-wisps, moving slow but steady along the old trail the train once paralleled. And he knew then that the wolves were indeed on the hunt. Their noses pointed straight at them, and by dawn this ruin would be surrounded if he didn't move before the trap closed. When the first blush of light touched the horizon, he roused Clara, helping her mount even as her body protested with pain from the fall. But she did not complain, only set her jaw with the stubborn resolve of someone who had nothing left but the road ahead, and they rode fast, the wind whipping her hair as the canyon opened before them, a maze of red stone and echoing chambers where sound carried for miles. And behind them, at last came the echo of hooves, faint at first but rising, nearer, stronger, until the walls themselves seemed to tremble with the chase. And the cowboy knew the first clash was near, that the men who had pushed her from the train would not rest until they had her bag, her secret, and her silence. Dawn broke hard and merciless across the desert, washing the world in fire and gold as the cowboy and Clara thundered through the canyon with the sound of pursuit echoing behind them, hooves striking stone like war drums calling men to battle. And though exhaustion pressed heavy on them both, there was no time for weakness, no space for hesitation. For the wolves that trailed them were closing in, and the promise he had spoken, "I'll take you the rest of the way," was not just words, but a vow binding him tighter than iron chains. A vow that meant even if he had to bleed and fall beneath the wide, indifferent sky, he would not let her be swallowed by the men who had already tried once to kill her. The canyon opened into a stretch of high desert plain where sagebrush bowed in the wind and vultures circled patiently above, as if knowing that sooner or later someone down below would fall. And the cowboy cut across the open land with his rifle strapped tight and his mind fixed on the town of Dry Creek, 2 days' ride to the east, where Clara swore someone waited who could take the ledger and bring justice to the powerful devils who wanted it destroyed. But 2 days was an eternity when death rode only minutes behind, and every rise in the land threatened to reveal their hunters cresting the ridge with rifles ready and no mercy in their hearts. Clara clung to him with the grim determination of someone who had already been to the edge and refused to go again, her face pale, but her eyes burning with a strange strength, and in the rattling rhythm of the horse's stride she confessed more than she had dared before, that the ledger had not only names and numbers, but evidence of a network of men who owned judges, marshals, and politicians across the territory, men who built their empires on blood and theft, and that if the ledger reached Washington it could tear apart everything they had built in secret. She had been nothing more than a schoolteacher once, content with chalk dust on her skirts and children's laughter in her ears, until fate placed the book in her hands through the desperate trust of a dying man on the train platform. A man who had whispered only, "Don't let them have it," before bleeding out in her arms. And from that moment, her life had become a storm with no shelter. The cowboy listened, his jaw set, his silence deep as a canyon. But inside him something stirred, an old wound of injustice he had carried since his own youth, when outlaws and lawmen alike had stolen from his family and left him with nothing but the saddle. And though he had spent years living as a shadow on the edge of other people's stories, he felt the weight of hers settle on his shoulders until it was no longer her burden alone, but his as well. They rode until the sun rose high, until heat shimmered off the ground, and the horse foamed with sweat. and finally the cowboy drew them into a gully shaded by stone, dismounting to check the land behind through a spyglass he carried. And sure enough, far back on the trail, 6 riders in dusters cut through the land like wolves, scenting blood, relentless, tireless, and closing fast. There was no outrunning such men forever, only outsmarting them. And so he studied the land, traced the dry gullies and jagged ridges with a hunter's eye, then led Clara on foot into the winding stone, where shadows played tricks and echoes could hide the sound of steps, guiding her through like a shepherd guiding lamb through wolf country, until at last they came upon the husk of an old mining camp, broken shacks and rusted equipment scattered like bones of forgotten men, and there he knew they could make a stand if they had to. Or at least buy themselves a night's reprieve from the chase. Clara trembled, but held steady as he set her inside the broken remains of a cabin, instructing her to stay low and silent while he scouted the perimeter. And in that moment she reached for his hand, her fingers small and fierce around his calloused grip, and whispered, "Oh, you could have left me a dozen times by now. Why haven't you?" He looked at her with the hard calm of a man who had lived too long alone and said only, "Because I said I'd take you the rest of the way, and a man's word has to mean something in this world, else we're no better than the wolves behind us." The words rooted something deep inside her, gave her strength where she thought she had none left. And as he stepped back into the burning light of day with rifle ready and eyes sharp, she knew then that whatever lay ahead, she was not walking it alone. By sundown the riders came, 6 shadows against the horizon, their laughter carrying cruel and confident, but the cowboy had prepared, setting false trails and broken brush to mislead, hiding their camp in the cracks of stone until darkness fell. And when gunfire finally cracked like thunder through the canyon, it was not their blood spilled first, but the outlaws', for the cowboy's aim was true and his will unbroken. Yet for every man that fell another pressed forward, and the night became a storm of lead and fire, Clara clutching the ledger to her chest as if it were a child, while the cowboy fought like a man who knew he had only this fight left in him. Until at last the canyon echoed with silence again, and only 3 riders remained alive, retreating into the night with curses on their lips and vengeance burning in their eyes. The cowboy bled from a wound in his arm, but tied it off with a strip of cloth, refusing to falter, and when Clara tried to protest, he silenced her with a glance that said pain was a companion he had long since made peace with. Together they saddled up once more beneath the cloak of stars, riding east toward Dry Creek with the knowledge that the final showdown was coming, that the 3 who remained would not stop, that the road ahead was narrowed to one last trial by fire. And somewhere beyond that trial lay the end of her journey, the fulfillment of his vow, and the hope that maybe, just maybe, a world rotting with corruption could still be cut open to let a little light through.